Good evening. I'm Bob Thurr, a board member at the Vilna Shul, and I want to welcome you to the Vilna and this virtual Vilna program. I want to thank our partner organizations, the Falmouth Jewish Congregation, the Worcester JCC, and the Jewish Book Council. The Vilna Shul is a Jewish cultural institution located in the historic Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. We focus on offering cultural programs from current events, authors, food, and so much more from a Jewish perspective. As the last remaining synagogue building from the more than 50 that once were in downtown Boston, the Vilna is also, when we can be, a historic museum and educational attraction. It's appropriate that the Vilna is hosting this program tonight on American Jewish voting, as for decades during the 20th century, the Vilna served as a polling place for Boston's West Enders, many of whom were Jewish. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to outline the format for this evening. Each guest will speak and then question one another. We will leave the last 20 minutes of our time together for audience Q&A. You can ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box located on your Zoom taskbar. Ken Wald has spent decades studying religion and politics and has recently turned his attention to the political behavior of American Jews. He asks why American Jews are so much more politically progressive than non-Jews in the US who share similar traits. His book, Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Award. Herb Weisberg is an emeritus professor of political science at Ohio State University. He attended the University of Minnesota and received a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan, where he taught for several years before moving on to Ohio State. His main areas of research are American voting and survey research, and he has written several books on both topics. Most recently, he has authored the 2019 book, The Politics of American Jews, and the chapter on the presidential voting of American Jews in the 2019 edition of the American Jewish Yearbook. Ken, please go ahead.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Okay. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. And I want to add my thanks to those of Bob to all the people whose efforts at the various venues made this possible. It's great to be here, even though it would be more fun to be seeing you face to face. Hopefully that'll be an option we have later on. As you heard from Bob, I've spent most of my career studying religion and politics, mostly in the United States. And I didn't focus on our own community, the American Jewish community, until relatively late in that career. It wasn't because I didn't find the community interesting. In point of fact, I found the politics of American Jews puzzling in major ways, but I didn't really think that I had any answers or anything original to say. So I waited a long time until I was able to think more carefully about the project and interact with other scholars. Let me begin by talking about how American Jews behave politically in the United States today, which is really how they've behaved for nearly a century now, since they moved into the Democratic Party in large numbers in the late 1920s. American Jews today are overwhelmingly democratic in their partisanship and tend to be liberal on most political issues. We know about their partisanship and ideology from what they've told us in surveys. And we also know in exit polls that they voted heavily for Democratic presidential and congressional candidates for a very long time. We also know that their financial contributions are skewed heavily toward Democratic candidates and organizations, and that when they do participate actively in politics, they typically do so through the Democratic Party. Now, I've given you the big picture here, and it's important to stress that there are nuances which I'm not covering at this point. I certainly don't mean to suggest that all American Jews behave the same way politically. there are Jewish Republicans and Jews who do not hold liberal views. And I don't mean to write them out of existence, but simply to note that they are a minority of the Jewish community and are likely to continue so for the immediate future. What puzzled me, there were really three things that puzzled me about the way American Jews engage in politics today. American Jews are different from Americans who are not Jewish, but who have similar levels of socioeconomic status, education, and income. Non-Jews with those qualities are much more likely to vote Republican and to hold conservative policy preferences than are Jews. Jews in the United States are also different politically from Jews in other countries. Indeed, today, the American Jewish diaspora is the only Jewish community for which we have data, a majority of whose members are located on the left side of their country's political spectrum. And finally, American Jews have become different from those groups who used to be their allies in what was called the Roosevelt or New Deal coalition, that large group of voters which accounted for the Democratic Party's dominance in American elections from the 1930s through the 1960s. But unlike many of the groups in that category, groups like white Anglo-Catholics, white Southerners, and labor union members, American Jews have not left the Democratic Party. They drifted away at the same time these other groups began to move away from the Democrats in the 70s and 80s. But unlike those two groups, they came back to the party in the 1990s and have remained disproportionately Democratic. They are one of the most Democratic constituencies in the electorate, and they are more or less as Democratic as white evangelicals are Republican. So while there have been efforts to explain the first puzzle, there really hasn't been much discussion about the second or third puzzle, the difference of Jews in the United States from Jews elsewhere and from other Americans who used to be part of the same political movement as American Jews. The argument I make in Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism is essentially that we need to focus less on American Jews and more on American Jews. That is to say, I argue in the book that a lot of what is distinctive about American Jewish political behavior in the United States is the fact that the United States has been a different place for American Jews, unlike most of the other places where Jews have lived in the modern era. And I argue that because of differences between the US and other countries where Jews have lived, that American Jews have developed a distinctive political outlook, an outlook that we political scientists call a political culture. It's a set of basic norms about politics and where the community stands on most of the issues. This culture was evident from the beginning of the founding of the United States in the 18th century and was largely consolidated by the end of the 19th century. I would argue it has remained a constant in American Jewish political life since then. This liberal culture, this classic liberal culture, rests on three assumptions. First, American Jews observed and liked the fact that under the Constitution, the government, the state, has no religious identity. America is not in any sense legally a Christian state. It is a state that's simply a state of its citizens, a state that does not have a religious identity in any formal or legal sense. Because the United States does not base citizenship on religion, as is often the case or was often the case in the 18th century, Jews observed that they had full rights of citizenship, and those rights were based on law, not on toleration. Jews, because they were part of the country, they were citizens, were entitled to the same rights, the political rights included, as every other American. And the final element of this Jewish political culture had to do with how the state should operate. Because the United States had a secular state, a state without religious identity, that in allocating benefits or imposing costs, the United States should not factor in religion. The state, in a sense, was agnostic. Religion was not part of the state, it was part of civil society. And in deciding on benefits and costs, religion of the citizens was essentially irrelevant. So the book traces how this doctrine was developed. And one of the things I discover is that American Jews were liberals in this classic sense long before they were Democrats. They didn't really become Democrats in large numbers until the late 1920s and 1930s, long after they had become liberals. And it wasn't liberalism of this nature that brought them into the Democratic Party. It was the Great Depression and the economic policies of the Democratic Party and the Roosevelt administration. But I also argue in the book what brought the Jews in the United States back to the Democratic Party in the 1990s was that this particular culture had come under attack. It had been attacked by a movement that emerged in the 1970s called the Christian right. And the Christian right was composed of people who did believe the United States was in some sense a Christian nation, that its values should reflect Christianity, and that Christian and religious institutions should be able to receive government support. That movement eventually was politicized. It became part of the Republican Party, and evangelical Protestants became the base of the Republican Party. And so for the first time in American history, that regime of religion and state based on liberalism that I talked about became a matter of political dispute between the parties. And as the Democratic Party was identified with the same kinds of liberal values on that issue as were American Jews, it had a powerful effect on bringing Jews back to the Democratic Party, where they largely reside to the present day. So that's the grand overview. I'm delighted to turn the dais over to my good friend, Herb Weisberg, who I'm sure will offer some important reactions and suggestions about this material. Herb?
Hi, Ken. Thanks. I assume my audio is on. Is that right? Well, thanks for including me today. And it's fun to be reunited with Ken Wald tonight to talk about this timely topic. Ken's book is a masterpiece, a definitive study of the basis of American Jews' politics and how their political worldview has developed. We approach the topic in somewhat different ways for our two books, but with quite similar views. Rather than repeat the many similarities, let me spend my time describing a couple of distinctive elements in my work. Now, I'm somebody who analyzes political surveys. It's always been difficult to obtain a scientific sample of Jews, but there are now several large, high-quality surveys, especially the Pew Research Center study of U.S. Jews conducted in 2013, which I'll use for a basis of some of my discussion tonight. And I'm going to highlight two of my results from the book. The first has to do with what I'm terming Jewish libertarians, a topic that's not usually discussed. These aren't necessarily libertarians in the Ron Paul sense of the term. They're Jews who are liberal on social and moral issues, like abortion and gay marriage, but they're laissez-faire on economics, such as on wanting low taxes with minimum federal programs. Now, that's not a straight liberal response or a straight conservative response pattern. It's a libertarian pattern, wanting minimal government in both areas. And about 25% of the survey of Jews in the surveys I've looked at have this response pattern. I certainly know several professionals, doctors, lawyers, and also business owners with that combination of views, and I would expect you might too. Now, these libertarian Jews aren't particularly happy with either party. They think the Democrats want too many federal programs supported by high taxes, while they see the Republicans as too opposed to abortion rights for women and equal rights for gays. So are they Republicans or Democrats? Well, they're in between. Among the general public, people with these views tend to be Republican, but Jews with this pattern are somewhat more on the Democratic side. Still, many of the Jews who vote Republican fall in this libertarian category, and these people could realign over the years. The other result I want to highlight tonight has to do with anti-Semitism. When I started analyzing surveys of Jews, I often included a question in my analysis about how serious Jews considered anti-Semitism in America. I never found that question statistically significant. And it wasn't significant, for example, when I analyzed a voting survey in fall 2016. But remember early 2017, all those phone bomb threats to Jewish community centers across the nation. Anti-Semitism was again raising its ugly head. And then came the August 2017 Unite the Right March through Charlottesville, with neo-Nazis shouting, "Jews will not replace us," and President Trump saying there were very fine people on both sides. When I analyzed an autumn 2017 survey by the same organization as that 2016 one, Jews who saw anti-Semitism as a serious threat were statistically more negative towards the Trump presidency, even when controlling statistically for other variables. And then after the Pittsburgh shootings, synagogue shootings in October 2018, a survey of Jews found that 72% said that they viewed Trump's comments and policies as at least somewhat responsible for these shootings. Jews' views on anti-Semitism were becoming politicized. Now, of course, there is anti-Semitism from the political left as well as from the political right, probably always has been. But after anti-Semitism from the political right reared its ugly head in Charlottesville and Pittsburgh, President Trump sought to counteract that by calling more attention to anti-Semitism from the political left, as embodied by Representative Ilhan Omar, the member of Congress who happens to be representing my hometown in Minneapolis. Still, in August 2019, a survey of Jews found that 64% found anti-Semitism from the political right to be more serious, versus only 16% considering anti-Semitism from the extreme political left as more serious. So views on anti-Semitism have become politicized, with most Jews now being more concerned with anti-Semitism from the political right. So what I'm doing, in other words, tonight is suggesting that these two factors should be taken into account when we consider Jews voting in the future. Those many Jewish libertarians who are not fully satisfied with either political party, and also the threat of anti-Semitism and how that has become politicized among Jews. Well, now it's time to start the discussion between Professor Wald and myself. And there are several topics we could talk about tonight, including how Jews voted in the 2020 election. But let me start off more historically. Why weren't Jews democratic before the mid to late 1920s? How did we start off? Ken, I can't hear you. Ken?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. American Jews tended to move between political parties for much of American history. They really didn't have a stable partisanship. There were some periods when they were very evenly divided between the parties, sometimes when they were more or less in one party's coalition. And again, our data on this aren't terribly good until we get into the 20th century. I think Jews, part of the reason I think why Jews would go with different parties is, as I said, their overriding concern to maintain the regime of religion and state, which they held responsible for their success, was not a matter that divided the major political parties. So Jews would work with any party in power if there was an issue they felt was a matter of concern. They didn't really care about what other, they didn't find one party a natural advocate, one an enemy. So there was no real incentive, I think, for them to adopt a consistent partisanship. And I think they tended to divide prior to the 1930s on, in some cases, local traditions, Jews in some areas being more Republican, some being more Democratic. And it really was, I think, the New Deal which powerfully affected Jews. A very substantial proportion of Jews were still working class in the 1930s, very strongly affected by the crash of the economy and industry. And again, they saw a Democratic president enacting policies many designed by Jewish social workers and Jewish public welfare experts, as something that the state really needed. And so that really drew them into the Republican Party. And that kept the majority of Jews there for a good long time, as we know, really until things started to change in the 1960s.
Okay. Was there also a socialist influence in terms of these European Jews who came over? Or is there any sign of that still today, or not really?
Well, there was this, of course, as people know, this great migration of Eastern European Jews, Jews from Russia, Poland, and other places in that area, who came to the United States, roughly most of them between the 1880s and the end of open immigration about 40 years later in the mid-20s. And this was the largest increase in the Jewish population that we'd seen in the United States. Most American Jews today still have at least one Eastern European grandparent in their family. And many of them came from Russia, where they had been attracted to socialists and parties and other parties, largely because socialism promised to address the poverty and privation that they experienced. And so many of them kind of carried that with them in their baggage as they crossed the Atlantic. And they came to a country that didn't really have a socialist tradition, and many of them joined parties and ultimately became, in a sense, adapted to the American party system, and most of them became Democrats in the process. My sense is that didn't last very long in terms of American Jewish history, that was a fairly quick transition, and their children and grandchildren, I think, were not socialists. They became solid Democrats.
The one thing I'd add is when I've looked at some of the data, to a surprising extent, many of the new immigrants, particularly from East Europe, did not become citizens. They saw that as an extra piece of bureaucracy. They weren't used to dealing with bureaucracy. They weren't used to taking tests like citizenship tests. And many didn't bother doing it, not until the New Deal, not until they saw Roosevelt bring the New Deal, the Depression to the end. But again, that decreased the influence of the Eastern European Jews initially in voting quite a bit. I mean, my grandparents became citizens right away, but that seems to be the exception.
Interesting.
Yeah. As we talked about most Jews being Democrat, there's one big group that's an exception, right? Orthodox Jews.
I'd say two groups that are exceptional. Yeah, Orthodox Jews, and again, we have to be very careful in talking about the Orthodox to recognize there are distinctive groups within that large umbrella, and we customarily distinguish between the modern Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, who are sometimes called Haredim, the Hebrew term that is used to describe them. And the modern Orthodox have become Republican. We still really don't have great data on them. They are a relatively small share of the total American Jewish population. And only recently with these very large surveys have we gotten enough to be even remotely comfortable with the predictions we've made. But they've been more Republican than other Jews. I feel safe saying that. There's questions about whether it's majority or beyond that. The ultra-Orthodox are less predictable. They share some of the conservative social values of white evangelicals and therefore are comfortable with Republican policies. But they're mostly concerned about obtaining resources to sustain their communities. And they have made, over the years, various alliances with Democratic leaders as well. So both of those groups are distinctive. I know you've talked a lot about the distinction between the Orthodox, the modern Orthodox, and the rest of the American Jewish community.
Right. There's clearly a difference in their politics and in their voting. I'm not sure when it started. There's some traces back to the 1970s, but it certainly seems to have become a major point at the moment. Should we turn to the 2020 election, or are there other topics you want to cover before that, Ken?
I'm willing to zoom to 2020.
How do you interpret Jews voting in the election?
Well, one of the challenges, and we've both been on the same listserv, so we understand that, is being confident on how American Jews actually did vote. I think the safest thing we can say is that there was no big change in 2020 from what we saw in 2016 or 2012 or whatever. The polls that I tend to think have the best sampling suggest a Jewish vote that was roughly 3-1 Democratic to Republican, which is a bit higher than we saw in 2012. Some of the surveys suggest it might have been higher than that, closer to 4-1. But again, we don't have some of the full data that we really need to assess many of these. And I think what happened is, there were significant Jewish doubts about Donald Trump in 2016. In fact, it was really striking in 2016 how badly Donald Trump did among Jews, given that some people thought he would do well because he has, after all, this observant Jewish daughter, as well as supporting, at the time, moving the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and engaging in other activities which many people on the right thought were positive. So some thought that he could do quite well. And he didn't do particularly well among Jews. And even among Jewish Republicans and Jewish Republican donors, he did appreciably less well than had, say, Mitt Romney just 4 years before. And it was the language he used when he attacked, when he attacked Mexicans, when he attacked immigrants in general, various slurs he made toward different groups. I think just reminded Jews about the dangers that happen when politics becomes about criticizing and attacking groups that are foreign and alien and immigrants and so forth, which is the Jewish history. And so he didn't do very well in 2016, and he did less well, I'm fairly sure, in 2020.
Yeah,
the things you talked about, added to the slippage.
Yeah, when I was working on my book, I was getting pretty far along in 2015, and I was seeing an opportunity for political realignment. The Iran treaty controversy, the nuclear accords, and some very respectable Jews being on both sides of the issue, on either side of the issue. For the first time, there's really that type of division in the Jewish community leaders, and for that matter, Jewish representatives or senators in Congress. And then came Trump on the scene, and I quickly pulled back working on my book. Something was changing quickly, and I realized better wait a year, see what happened. And in the end, as you say, I think Jews stayed away, became perhaps even less Republican in their voting by a little in 2016. And that seems to be the pattern again in 2020.
It's funny, I know you've probably had the same circumstance. Ever since I started writing about Jewish politics, I have a sure indicator of when fall begins. And it's not when the leaves begin to turn, because they don't turn in Florida. It's the first call I get from a reporter asking me, I've heard lots of things that there's unhappiness with the Democratic presidential candidate, and lots of my Jewish friends are telling me they're going to vote Republican. Is this the year, Dr. Wald, when Jews will finally go over to the Republican Party, which some conservatives have been expecting for decades? And I always tell them, no, this is not the year. It's unlikely we're going to see a year when this happens. I got fewer of those calls this year because it seemed pretty clear to reporters that there was a lot of unhappiness among the Jewish community generally with Trump's policies, and in particular his behavior with regard to immigrants and the like.
What would it take, Ken, for Jews to change their politics? And do you see that as likely or not? I mean, it's hard to foretell the future. I mean, political scientists are much better in predicting the past than the future, is the old saying.
Yeah, and even there, we're not always good. I mean, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see a massive change. What would it take? One argument is that there's going to be change because of demography. Both the modern Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox have significantly higher birth rates and are more likely to keep their kids within the Jewish tradition than is true of Jews from other denominations or who are non-denominational. And so the growth of population will ultimately make the difference. I'm not impressed by that argument. It'll make some difference, but from what I've seen in other countries, it doesn't necessarily have that effect. I think it would take several things. I think the Democratic Party at its elite level, at the policymaking positions, would have to embrace positions that were clearly hostile or critical of Israel. It's one thing when a first-term backbencher like Ilhan Omer says some things about Israel which are not positive. It's quite another, though, when the party leadership, we're the party leadership to do that. And I frankly don't see that coming, because I think the leadership of the party, including the rising generation for the most part, is more balanced on those issues. So, but I think a clear signal that, of hostility to Israel, even though American Jews don't typically vote on that basis, would be an important factor. Other than that, some major realignment of the parties, but again, I just don't see it happening in a way that would change the Jewish attraction to the Democratic Party. How about you? What do you think?
I certainly agree in terms of Israel. The way I would put it would be, if there was, as long as the Democratic Party leadership keeps putting Israeli security as a priority and making sure that Israel is secure militarily, that would matter the most. If there's really a strong argument that we are letting them down and we're not backing them up in a crisis, that would be a major issue. But I'm agreeing with you there. I think a lot depends how the Republican Party is going to evolve over the next few years. How important Trump is going to be, Donald Trump, and if, for that matter, if Trumpism is going to continue to dominate the Republican Party. If he keeps holding power, Jews are likely to stay on the Democratic side. Those Jewish libertarians I was describing would certainly be willing to move to the Republican Party if the Christian evangelical positions became less powerful in the GOP. But I don't see that happening. I mean, they're much more important. The evangelicals are so much larger group than Jews. There's no reason for the Republican Party to give up, that strong base and wander away from them. Go ahead.
Yeah, in a sense, Jews have been negatively affected by two groups who the Republicans have become more important in the party. And these same groups have also sent other voting groups more toward a Democratic direction, suburban housewives and the like. And the first, as you say, is Christian conservatives, whose positions on social issues are just unacceptable to many Jews. But the second group is the group you mentioned in relationship to anti-Semitism, the alt-right. People forget that the patron of the alt-right, the person who gave them a platform, was none other than Steve Bannon, Trump's senior advisor. And that's a pretty powerful statement to make. And it's clear the alt-right is supportive of Trump and Trumpism. And I think so long as the Republican Party is identified with those two groups in the public mind, it's going to have a hard time, doing well with Jews. It's going to have a hard time doing well with women, particularly suburban women. And the group that really is exploding in size are those groups who, when asked their religion, indicate that they have no religious affiliation. Doesn't mean they're atheists, doesn't mean they're hostile to religion, but they're simply the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. And they may now be the largest bloc within the American religious grouping. They have been growing dramatically. And they're politically diverse, but they have moved heavily against the Republican Party. Some of them because they see it as co-opting the churches, some because they are, again, liberal on social issues. So the Republican Party's problem is that it's anchored in groups that are not popular with the rest of the electorate. So I think that's what's going to happen in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, when I looked at the 2020 election and the influence there, what I was noticing, particularly here, on the one hand, President Trump was attacking the Squad and their views on Palestine and Israel. But on the other hand, our synagogue had a police presence for the first time for security. And many people associated that with the alt-right, with what happened in Pittsburgh, what happened in San Diego. And that really seemed to be the factor that was really going to keep the majority of Jews solidly in the Democratic camp again this year. And I think it did in 2020. Again, how that factors into the future is hard to say. And for that matter, what happens with COVID is hard to say. In my book, I looked a little at generational differences, and you could see some differences between different generations. I mean, clearly the younger generation, the millennial generation, is less supportive, cares less about Israel than the senior generation now among Jews. And that is a difference in generational replacement that is going to have an effect. But when I look to see in terms of politics, there wasn't much difference. The younger generation was a few percentage points more liberal and more in favor of expanding government programs than the older generation. But that was in the 2013 Pew survey. I don't know whether with AOC, with progressives coming in, with 4 years of Trump's administration, if that's going to change. And I think I understand that there'll be a new Pew survey sometime soon. And that may help us understand that, whether there are generational differences that matter.
Yeah. The other thing that I've been struck by, and I haven't seen anything from the election that I'm confident in, is there is a gender gap within the Jewish community, but it's much less significant than it is within the non-Jewish community. The percentage differences from what I've looked at, and this is prior to 2020, indicated it was really a slight variation. Again, it wasn't, we're not talking about a 20 or 30% gap. And so once again, yes, there's differences, but it just pales in comparison with the rest of the electorate.
I looked at the same thing today, and it was more like 10%, a little more in some surveys, a little less in other surveys. It is there, but not as large as for the general population. I agree. What about the Jews' relations with Blacks? You mentioned it peripherally earlier in terms of, that was affecting Jews' politics, say in the 1980s, and then came along the Christian right influence in the Republican Party. What about the Black Lives Matter movement now and the anti-racism movement? Is that going to affect Jews' politics, do you think?
Well, again, we're kind of having to stir the tea leaves and guess about this. The conflicts that broke out between Jews and African Americans in the 60s and 70s really had to do with what sociologists called ethnic succession, that African Americans migrated to the city, and they encountered, the previous generations that were there. And it occurred over, business ownership, over positions in the public schools and things of that nature. And to some people, it was coded as a kind of a racial conflict, even though I don't think at the base it really was. And the issue for many American Jews at the time, many American Jews perceived African Americans as anti-Semitic, and many African Americans perceived Jews as racist. And I think, there are components of that in both communities. I don't think that was really what was driving it fundamentally. But a lot of it really congealed into the issue of affirmative action, which for a liberal constituency was a real problem. American Jews, particularly when affirmative action was in what's called its hard form, when it was talking about quotas in terms of public employment and admission into universities and things of that nature, was very difficult for Jews to take, because Jews had been the victims of quotas for so many years, and it was hard to embrace these. And the idea of quotas, the idea that public goods should be distributed based on race or other qualities, just runs headlong into the classic liberalism of American Jews. But I think over time that conflict muted. In fact, one of the ironies is that Jewish women were among the main beneficiaries of affirmative action. And I think to some extent the issue became less severe as time passed. My impression here from surveys that were done at the time is that American Jews were generally sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement in general. That they had a long history, Jews did, of sympathizing with Black desires to be treated equally in a non-discriminatory fashion. And that as a rule, they were generally supportive of the movement. They were nervous about some of the people in the leadership who seemed to have a history of anti-Israeli comments, which in the minds of many Jews, it's not a big leap between anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic, even though I would argue there's a distinction there. But I think there is that core sympathy, because again, Jews have been there, not nearly to the same degree as African Americans, but Jews have a history of experiencing job discrimination and discrimination in admission to universities and the like. And so I think there's a shared sense that the state has a role to step in and promote justice and equity. that's just, I don't have much data, so I'm curious if you have found data that casts doubt on this or no.
No, I haven't found any data. I wish I had more data from my family in Minneapolis in terms of their reactions to the events there. But even there, I don't have much reaction.
Yeah.
Pamela, is it time to turn back to you in terms of questions and answers from questions from the audience?
Yes, this would be an excellent time.
Good. Okay.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Rothstein. I serve as Director of Lifelong Learning at Falmouth Jewish Congregation on Cape Cod. So we have a number of questions that have come in, and I want to encourage those of you who do have questions to send them via the Q&A rather than the chat. So to start with, we have a question regarding why Jews turned away from the Democratic Party in the 70s and 80s and voted for Reagan.
Okay. A majority of Jews did not vote for Reagan in either 1980 or 1984. In 1980, the Jewish vote was split, but most of the Democrats most of the Jews or a goodly number of the Jews who'd been voting Democrat ended up voting for John Anderson, the independent candidate. But it was, again, a narrower vote than had been experienced throughout much of the 20th century. And a lot of it, I think, was very specifically anti-Carter and anti some of the policies that were enunciated during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Was more particular about that. I think the 1980 election was a referendum on Carter, just as the 2020 election was a referendum on President Trump. But it was, again, this sort of complex of issues, the rise of, going back to the 60s and 70s, the rise of the Black Power movement, which to many Jews appeared to suggest that they had no role in promoting civil rights. The many Jewish volunteers who'd been involved in the movement were essentially asked to leave. And there were leaders of the movement who expressed anti-Semitic sentiments in the 70s and so forth. And some of the businesses that were targeted when there was political violence in this period, and I want to stress that there wasn't a lot of violence and much of it was aimed at, legal protesters, but some Jewish stores and businesses were attacked in that period. But I think the affirmative action issue in some ways had more to do. It sort of crystallized all those concerns. Again, it turned out to be a relatively short-term movement. By the early 90s, the Jewish vote was back up at levels we had seen in the 40s and 50s. So it was a relatively short term. Herb, you're the real numbers guy, so you may have some things to add here.
I fully agree. I mean, in 1980, with the high inflation, the prolonged Iran hostage crisis, Americans in general, many turned away from Carter, and Jews among them. And as you say, there was a significant Jewish vote for John Anderson that year, even though he once had sponsored a Christian amendment to the Constitution. And by 1984, the Jewish vote was back in the Democratic camp, even though Mondale was not the most popular candidate ever among the electorate as a whole. So I agree fully with your analysis.
Okay. So another one, some of these questions try to break down the monolithic aspect of American Jews, whether it's a question about gender or geography. And this one asks you to comment on what you've learned about the differences between Sephardic Jews voting patterns and Jews of color vis-a-vis Ashkenazic Jews of European descent. Can either of you comment on that?
It's really funny. I got an announcement today about a special issue of a journal where they want to talk about a Jewish studies journal. They want to talk about Sephardi Ashkenazi differences. And I began to think, has there been any political work in the United States on this issue? There's a lot of work in Israel, but I didn't know of any work in the United States. And I've been looking for data today just because it's an interesting question. And so far, I haven't found anything that looked very good to me. And I think part of the phenomenon is that while the Sephardi, particularly the Sephardi Mizrahi versus Ashkenazi debate in Israel is central, Sephardi and Ashkenazi and Mizrahi in the United States, I think, doesn't have that same resonance here. I'm struck by all the years of teaching at the University of Florida, teaching Jewish studies classes. I rarely had students who talked much about being Sephardi or Ashkenazim. Many of them came from mixed marriages, and one parent was Sephardi, one was Ashkenazim. But I don't know that it resonates per se here. Again, for those Sephardim who came to, who left, who left Arab states in the 50s, it may still be an issue, but I don't know of much data on those particular groups. It just hasn't been a subject of study using the kinds of tools that Herb and I typically use. Do you know of anything, Herb?
No, I mean, I wish there was data on Jews of color as well as on Sephardic Jews. And it's ironic, given that Sephardic Jews, I mean, that's how the early US Jews were Sephardic. That's definitely they were Sephardim. But there's just not data on that group today. I mean, there were differences between the German Jews who came to the US and the so-called Russian Jews, the Central European versus the Eastern European. But we don't have any data on those from the original Sephardim group.
Okay. A similar kind of question. Do you have statistics about any geographic breakdown within the American Jewish vote? Any regional differences?
Yeah, I'll take a general shot at it, Herb. You can come in as well, because my sense again is that overall, the Jews who vote in the United States don't vote radically differently based on where they live. They are less likely, even Southern Jews are more likely to be Democratic than non-Jews in the South and the like. There can be some differences, but again, they're not major differences as they are for the rest of the electorate. And some of the differences are a function of the presence in large numbers of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. That may not be a geographical effect, just that's where they are and that's where they vote. So again, I don't see, dramatic differences in Jewish political behavior based on geography across the United States. But Herb, what do you say?
I think there are some articles in the last couple of weeks from the large VoteCast survey taken after the election, and we could debate how good or bad that is. But showing for New York and Florida, the Republican vote by Jews was a little higher than that in other states. But that's because of higher Orthodox presence in those states, exactly as Ken said.
Okay. Question, if you adjust for education levels, how different is the Jewish vote from the non-Jewish vote?
Well, this is my favorite question because a lot of analysis in my book compares Jews to non-Jews who resemble them socioeconomically. Let's go to one of the tables that I had in the PowerPoint. Let me see, assuming I didn't get rid of it. I may actually have gotten rid of it for this one. Give me a second. I need to check which one it is. Okay, yeah, it's, can you put up on the screen the 6th slide? It's labeled Partisanship of Jews versus Matched Non-Jews.
Go ahead, you should be able to see it now.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. Let me get back to the screen here. Yes, okay. So what I did here was to compare the partisanship of Jews versus matched non-Jews. And these are people who resemble the Jewish population in about, I think, 20 characteristics, including education, income, occupational status, where they live, meaning the type of community, the region they live, their, being predominantly non-Hispanic, marital status, and the like. And so the non-Jews in this survey are, again, the differences control not just for education, but for a whole range of factors that are associated with education. And what you see here is that there is a very pronounced pro-democratic skew even after we control for education and these other qualities. that whereas only about a quarter of Jews identified as Republicans, either saying they were Republican or saying they were independents who leaned to the Republicans, whereas 44% of the non-Jews in that category did identify as Republicans. And conversely, only 46% of the non-Jews who resembled Jews were Democrats, whereas almost 2/3 of the Jews were Democrats. So the really striking thing, and this is something that led to this politically incorrect but inescapable comment by the late Milton Himmelfarb, that American Jews earn like Episcopalians but vote like Puerto Ricans. That is, they have the social status of high status American groups, but their politics are very different. And I usually just sum the difference in the two major partisan categories and ignore the signs, and that comes to a skew of 34%. So the bottom line is Jews are much more democratic and much more liberal, even when we control for factors that you would think would reduce the difference. Herb, you want to comment?
I'll just toss in a little different direction, and that's in terms of voting turnout. 2020 election was high turnout of every group, I think, but historically, the presidential voting turnout in the U.S. has been around 50% or so, and Jews, about 90% of them have been voting, and it's like the 11th commandment for Jews was "Thou shalt vote." And I think you and I both did in our book some analysis looking at voting turnout. And there the difference really diminishes quite a bit. When you put in enough controls on education, occupation, income, yeah, there's a difference, but it's truly slight. Ken?
Yeah. It's when it comes to turnout, yes, it is there, but it's not predominantly because they're Jewish. When you come to the content of the political beliefs they hold, Jews still stand out even from well-educated, high-income, high-status non-Jews in the United States.
Okay, I have another question for you, which takes us out of the realm of voting and into the question of how politically active are American Jews running for office, both nationally and locally. Is that something that you've examined?
Herb, you want to have a shot at this?
They're certainly politically active. There's no doubt about that. I don't have any particular data on it. I think we can see it just in terms of, well, US senators, US representatives, that there are more Jews than you might expect, given our population proportion, and even from states where you would not expect it. Trivia question, what is the only state that's ever elected 4 Jews at different times, of course, to the US Senate? And it turns out to be my home state of Minnesota, where you'd expect a lot of Scandinavians to be elected, but not Jews. It's just Jews have been politically active, and that there is an effect there. Ken?
My guess here is that Jews are so politically overrepresented at the elite levels of the political system, not just as candidates, but as journalists, as campaign managers and the like. And I don't think it's largely because they're Jews. Again, the political elite tends to be composed of people who have high levels of education, often in more prestigious universities, who are, in addition to being well educated, likely to practice law, which is often the route to holding public office. And Jews tend to be overrepresented in the legal profession, and they tend to be overrepresented in elite universities and colleges. And they probably come from backgrounds where, they come from families of high social status. They're in jobs that enable them to network and probably raise political funds. So I think if you did have a comparison where you controlled for a lot of those things, it would be like the turnout difference. It would, I think, have relatively little to do with their being Jewish and more to do with the kinds of things that turn people from being citizens to being candidates for public office. I think there the causal impact of Judaism is pretty limited.
Okay, and one or two more questions. Here's a question. Where do you see American Jewish politics going if Jews have to choose between the rise of American anti-Semitism and policy towards Israel, especially if a party is both pro-Israel and anti-Semitic at the same time?
I feel like I want to quote Amy Coney Barrett and say that I don't respond to hypothetical cases, but so much depends on the specifics of the case. And for example, let's talk about the Israel question, because I think that's a conversation that needs to take place. Zev, I'm forgetting Zev's last name. He'll never give me. Wrote a really fine book, a scholar now at UCLA, called Trouble in the Tribe, about internal political differences in the American Jewish community. And he made the observation that part of what American Jews are arguing about these days when it comes to Israel is not, who's more pro-Israel than others. It's what does it mean to be pro-Israel? And are there different ways of being pro-Israel? Can being critical of the Israeli government be seen as a form of supporting Israel because one wants to see it behave in a different way? And so I think that one of the problems with the discussion about anti-Semitism is it's been very narrow. The assumption is you're only pro-Israel if you support the Likud government. That's essentially what Trump's position has been. And I think that debate is more confusing and perhaps less likely to divide people. And there's also the complexity about, leadership. I'm always struck by the fact that there's this image that Barack Obama, when he was president, had a bad relationship with Israel or was anti-Israel. The head of the Israel Security Services said publicly, and was once quoted as saying during the Obama administration, that the US and Israel had never had as strong a strategic relationship as they did during the years that Obama was president. Now, Obama didn't get along with Benjamin Netanyahu. Not many people do, I should point out, Israelis or any of his ex-wives. But fundamentally, I think that as a debate goes, it's not a very good debate. So being pro-Israel is, I think, or anti-Israel is I think very confusing. And again, I think with Herb, the real question is, are the two parties going to have light between them on this issue? And I don't see it as happening. American Jews in the situation the question implies would be cross-pressured. They'd feel pressure one way because of one issue and one for the other. And, cross-pressure can produce lots of different kinds of behaviors. I remember that literature from the 60s. So, it's hard to say anything more specific. I think it would really depend on the specifics of the case and who we were talking about.
Okay. A question about voting patterns. Can you comment on voting patterns among Jews who are parts of interfaith marriages, mixed religious marriages?
Herb, why don't you take that?
I did look at the politics of those groups to some extent, but I'm not going to remember the data on that. Ken, do you?
My memory is that the spouse who converted is somewhat less democratic than the spouse who was born or raised Jewish. Not, again, a massive difference. Right. That's my memory of reading your book. So
let me agree. Right. There is a difference, but not huge. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is that, when Jews intermarry, they tend to intermarry people who have many of the traits that we associate with being Jewish. They tend to marry, partners who have high levels of education, often professional education and positions, and they often work in the same kinds of environments. So their politics we would not expect it to be radically different in that sense. So I think that it is, the effect is probably fairly minimal.
And nowadays, politics is, for better or worse, becoming one of the factors in selecting a spouse too. So homogeneity on that matter. So even more so probably now.
Yeah. There's one group neither of us has talked about that I do think needs to be talked, and that's the Russian Jews, the post-1989 groups. Why don't you take that, because you write about that much more detail than I do.
Well, there's the Jews from the former Soviet Union, and for that matter, from some of the ex-communist nations. And that group is definitely more Republican than other Jews in the US. Not a huge difference. When I tried looking at it, I think it was more like 10, 15%, not 30 or 50% difference. And the question there has always been why, and there are different explanations given, and our explanations may be different. But one explanation I have always heard is that the Jews, whether it's in Cuba or the former Soviet Union, they grew up in a totalitarian regime where they really strong state, and they viewed that as diminishing their rights. And so they're really more willing to go to the Republican Party, seeing the Democrats as too liberal, the same way the government that they left in the other country. But there could be other explanations as well. But again, it's not the largest difference, but it is a difference that does exist.
Yeah. And the work that has been done on post-1989 Russian Jewry coming in the United States suggests that while those people who were adults when they came over were more Republican than other Jews, their children, who by now have had several decades in the U.S., are not different from their peers in the Jewish community. So that appears, at least for the Russians, who were the biggest influx since the survivors of the Holocaust after World War II. For the Russians, that appears to have been a one-generational phenomenon. Their kids are not very different politically.
Right.
Okay, one or two more questions, and then we'll bring it to an end. And this one caught my attention. Somebody has posed, since you're probably looking for something else to focus on, Ken. Somebody's asking if you or other people in the field will be focusing on Jews of color and that demographic increases in number and what effect that has on voting trends.
Well, I can tell you, I think Herb and I look at the same source. There is a listserv sponsored by a group called the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry. It's social scientists like us who look at Jews. And there's been a lot of discussion there about Jews of color and about the concept itself, the term, which is challenging and problematic, as well as the diversity of the groups that are said to fit under that particular rubric. And right now, most of the debate is about the size of this community and its composition. There hasn't been much that I can recall that deals with the politics of it. It's in the sense of voting patterns. It's much more about the attempts by representatives of that group or individuals who claim to be representatives of those groups to get a voice in policymaking within Jewish communal organizations and Jewish communal life. So I don't know, as that community grows, it could go in different ways because, again, the diversity within it probably means that it's not all of one mind in that particular category. And there's real questions about, how open the American Jewish community has been to Jews who do not fit the, at least the Ashkenazi stereotype. I'll put it that way in that category. That's what I know.
Herb, do you want to add anything?
Not really. I know the reform movement is definitely beginning to explore more contact, more focus in terms of Jews of color, but I've not seen anything about the politics yet of that group, however it is defined.
Okay, we are going to turn this over to Nancy from the Worcester JCC. There are plenty of other questions, so we want to thank everybody who did pose your questions, and sorry if we couldn't get to yours.
Thanks, Pamela. And hi, I'm Nancy Greenberg. I'm the Cultural Arts Director at the Worcester JCC. On behalf of the Vilna, Falmouth Jewish Congregation, Worcester JCC, and Jewish Book Council, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Ken Wald for generously sharing your time and expertise tonight. Ken, thank you for providing us with fresh insight into the riddle of American Jewish electoral choices and the enduring attraction of liberalism, and for shedding light on the Jewish vote vis-a-vis the recent presidential election. And thank you to Herb Weisberg for helping to illuminate why Jewish voting is distinctive and paradoxical, and for an engaging dialogue with Ken. Be sure to order your own copy of Ken's book, Foundations of American Liberalism, and Herb's book, The Politics of American Jews. Ken's book is available for online purchase through local independent bookstore 8 Cousins. That's 8cousins.com, and also on bookshop.org and Amazon. And Herb's book is available from Amazon and bookshop.org. Thank you to our audience this evening. Please mark your calendar and watch your email for these upcoming partnership programs. Anti-racism and economic empowerment, remaking ourselves as more effective allies, a 3-part series starting Wednesday, December 2nd, and then Monday, December 7th, and Monday, December 14th, all at 7 p.m. And Lisa Gruenberg, Thursday, December 10th at 7 p.m., a Boston physician and author of City of Dreams, discussing how she unexpectedly found herself writing a memoir when trying to recreate her father's life in Vienna before the war. This program will start with a community candlelighting in celebration of the first night of Hanukkah. Both of these programs are free and require pre-registration on Zoom. Please note that you will receive via email tomorrow the link with tonight's recorded program and details on these upcoming events. Thank you to my colleagues Lynn Krasker-Schultz of the Vilna and Pamela Rothstein of Falmouth Jewish Congregation. Collaborating on virtual programs has been one of the silver linings of the pandemic. To all, stay safe and stay well. Thank you and good night from all of us.
Good night. Thanks for having us.
Good night.